I'm delighted to introduce you to the student panel. We have 5 students on the panel, and Asha, the 6th person, is going to facilitate this session. And Asha is the president of the UCC Students' Union. She is the 6th woman president since 1908. So that means that in 114 years, this university has had 108 male presidents. So, and she is the, yes, she's the 6th woman president. Yes, that's right. And it's 18 years since we've had the last woman president. So things hopefully are changing. This is Asha's 2nd term as president, which also makes her the 2nd person to run the 2nd time, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. And normally we'd have officers, I suppose, that would run a 2nd time, for example, welfare or education, but not usually the president would run a 2nd time. So well done, Asha, and congratulations. We're delighted to have you on board. Okay, the panel will explore the multifaceted role of student leaders and the role they will play to meet the agenda of 2030. They will delve into their own personal experiences as student leaders and how they came to learn about the SDGs and how they use the SDGs in their lives. They will discuss the importance of the student voice in informing and shaping sustainable development. And they will explore how education can be used as a tool to empower students to be active global citizens. The students will begin this session by introducing themselves, and they will take turns in speaking, and we will have, perhaps, hopefully, we will have a 15-minute Q&A session at the end of this. But before I hand you over to the panel, I want to play you a short video clip. We wanted to hear the global student voice. So we asked students 3 questions. We asked them, you know, we asked various members of IASIS to ask students on their campuses these questions. We asked students on our campuses these questions. Campus Radio did a vox pop. So we have lots of answers to these questions, but we are just going to show you a tiny little snippet. And the questions were, you know, what does the world look like to you in 2030? What do you see it looking like in 2030? And what values are important to you as a student? And how is your university or your college experience supporting you to affect positive change in the world? So we'll have a look at that, just like it's 2 minutes. And we'll hand you over to the panel then.
It's really a pleasure to be here today and to have the opportunity to really centre the student perspective and student voice on things. It was great. I got such a privilege to work with Noreen and to be brought into this, and it was really key for me when talking to Noreen that this was taking place like in the middle of the summit, because I really think that the student voice should really inform all the work that you're all doing in your student support services and things like that. So without further ado, I'm just going to pass the mic on to all our panelists and ask them to briefly introduce themselves and tell us a bit about their background and maybe particularly where you've kind of crossed paths with the SDGs generally in your work. So Maya first.
So hello, my name is Maya. I use she, her pronouns, and I have just hopefully finished my degree in International Development and Food Policy here in UCC, and I'm currently working just a few floors down as the Society's president for the next year. So in terms of the SDGs, how I was introduced to them, so back in the day when I was in TY, there was a film module delivered by the Ymca, which is a youth information service in Cork. And it was all about helping young people develop their voices and, I suppose, meld the 2 areas of digital media with kind of social justice together and using it as a tool to amplify experiences and issues. And that's kind of where I found out about them. They kind of explored them with us. It was funded by by, I think, the Department of Children and Youth Affairs at the time. So it was all part of the 2030 programme. And since then, I suppose I've been involved, maybe not deliberately with the SDGs, but they kind of create a framework in a lot of the youth work organisations in Ireland. And I've been involved with the Ymca for a long time now as a volunteer and then a youth worker. Last year, I delivered a programme on climate justice called Future Generations. It was part of a consortia with the National Youth Council and a number of other organisations, and it was all about working with young people to explore the area of climate justice and the SDGs, and really reaching into, I suppose, communities that are not often represented or amplified in conversations around youth work and policy and things like that. And then I ended up, well, not ended up, I was elected as the chair of the International Development and Global Justice Committee for Ymca. So my role is now a trustee, and it's all about working with young people in the area of social justice and climate justice, and ensuring that these voices are, especially those who are least heard in these conversations, but most affected, that they are represented and amplified and have a really consistent place throughout our work, in terms of from participation level, but also in terms of like a board level and a strategy level. And we work a lot with other organizations in that. And then with societies, I think this is the best thing, is we're talking about community and things like that, and education, the power of that. My role is all about supporting student leaders in UCC to deliver events and actions, and whether or not they are aware of it, they embody the SDGs and I suppose some of the values in that kind of framework, especially as we are in UCC, which has adopted them so strongly into the ethos. But yeah, lots of little bits and pieces. They kind of crop up every now and then, and we can see them around on the boards and stuff with grad attributes. But yeah, that's me, I guess. Yeah, Ruben.
Hiya, my name is Ruben. I'm a government and politics student here in UCC. In the past, so my work has mainly been in relation with organisations that was about youth advocacy and secondary school education policy at a national level. And so a lot of it actually, it was not something, the SDGs was more something that we would have spoken about rather than specifically working on specific strategies. But our work was very much part of the SDGs. It just didn't necessarily hadn't made the link, so we were working on stuff like sort of poverty and inequalities that were present within these systems, and trying to work on how to address these. And now I'm after coming and starting here in UCC.
Hi, my name is Ayana. I'm an international development student, so I would have come across the SDGs in that, but also generally kind of in some of the organizations that I worked with in the past surrounding climate. However, like I do find that in a lot of student voice and activism work, like we don't talk explicitly about the SDGs, because the SDGs are mostly like useful as a framework for like global or national development, to highlight like the interdependence of I guess global systems such as, you know, climate, economy, and human development. So like on an individual level, engaging with that is there's not much point. Like it's good to be aware of them, but like more than anything, they're a set of very broad titles for issues that people have already been working on for a long time. And in that sense, like the SDGs don't really add much new to the conversations of student activists that are still working on whatever issue they already cared about, and hopefully they're keeping the intersectionality idea of the SDGs and, you know, the global solidarity at the core of their work anyway, whether or not they know about the like SDG number that the UN has put before the issue they already cared about. So yeah.
Diogwif, I'm Ali. I'm a master's student in NUI Galway in environmental leadership, and before this I did a zoology degree in UCD, and this is kind of where I first came across the SDGs. They were running a range of chats from the academics mostly talking about the life on water and life on land, as we are School of Biology. And we were all invited to those, and I guess that's where most of my friends kind of started learning about them. And then I wanted to step away from the very science heavy side of it and look to see how we can link the biodiversity and environmental crises with the other parts of life, which is where I moved into this master's, where we are really looking to connect the science with communication and policy. And I guess now I've touched on the SDGs a bit more. Nearly every module I've taken has at least mentioned them once, if not had a few weeks work on them. And yeah, I guess they do come into play everywhere, no matter what you do. It is something you are kind of looking at, but the relevance of each one or how specifically you look at it very much depends on how you go forward with it and what way you're trying to use them.
So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for the lovely setting. It's such a great opportunity to talk about how student activism can be properly embedded in educational settings. I am Giacomo, I'm from Italy. That's probably the most Italian name you will hear today. And I've gone through many different paths, and I've had a lot of encounters with the SDG and the sustainable agenda. I started in public Italian educational system, and then I transitioned into American educational systems in Italy, and then now I'm a postgraduate researcher at TU Dublin. So I've had a very diverse experience with educational, like institutional frameworks also, and how different SDGs are embedded into education. But my fascination with SDGs goes back a little bit earlier. So when I was 17, I traveled for the first time to join an international volunteering project in Belgium. And when I arrived, I realized that there were members of this project coming from 4 different continents. They had zero connection with each other, and yet they shared to the very commas and points and dots what they want out of society and how to properly manage the resources in society to achieve sustainable development. So there I realized that the Sustainable Development Challenge is an epistemic one. It's intrinsically education driven. So when I went back to Italy, then I joined other 6 projects in 6 different countries in Europe. So I had a chance to talk with a lot more activists in this field, especially on wildlife conservation. And then I decided to bring back all these lessons into Italy, and I became a sustainability advocate in Italian high schools and also in my university framework. Then I became the president of the environmental organization in my own university, started doing classes and lectures for Italian public high schools because we still don't have a consistent framework to teach about sustainable development. And also I've had the chance to work with the Ministry for Economic Development during the COVID period in order to make proposals on how to properly allocate funds for the post-COVID recovery for sustainable transition. Well, now I'm here in Ireland, so I just am absolutely fascinated about the sustainability challenge because it's so intrinsically multifaceted. And I hope today will give a lot of insight in how different stakeholders can really find in universities the galvanizing hub for sustainability action. Thank you.
Thanks. It was really interesting to hear about all your backgrounds, and I think you both kind of touched on how the SDGs is a framework, but the reality that it might not directly be highlighted in some work that people are doing, but a lot of that work has been going on, and it's been going on for a very long time. So I think for university leaders, national leaders, international leaders, I think when you're coming to meet students with this framework, it's important to recognize that the work that they're already doing and how you can help to enhance that then with the framework you're bringing. So I suppose if I could ask you next, what role do you think student leaders and the student movement generally has played in achieving the SDGs or working towards the SDGs, both directly or indirectly, and maybe speak to your personal kind of experiences and things like that?
Yeah, I'm almost going first, which makes life kind of a little bit more difficult. Unless someone else wants to go first. Great. Okay. I guess that answers my question. I suppose in terms of students, I suppose student is such a broad definition, because there's students in like national school, there's students secondary schools, there's students in universities, and of course there's a whole different age demographic. You can be any age and be a student, so it's kind of anyone in the education system, and then not even necessarily, like there's learning is kind of a lifelong journey, I guess. So it depends what a student actually is. Sorry, that was very deep. No, I suppose in terms of my own perspective and in my own work, I think students hold an essential role in this kind of, when it comes to addressing anything related to social justice or environmental justice or the inequalities in our society. And I think we can see that very, very clearly in terms of structures like the Students' Union, and obviously I'm going to shout out societies, but in general, in students in general, like we saw, you know, with Fridays for Future, and how when students took a stand and, you know, exited all the classrooms, that people didn't know what to do with themselves. You know, empty classrooms, you can't force people to go back in and work. And I suppose in terms of the role, I think the peer-to-peer education is possibly the most important. In my experience, I found that meeting someone, another young person in my community who had taken part in some education stuff relating to the SDGs, that it meant that I wanted to get involved and I wanted to engage, rather than someone in a classroom telling me that I needed to engage because it was my future on the line. That actually just makes me go backwards and I'm less likely to engage. So I suppose in terms of students' role, I think we already kind of have quite a strong role. And I think we have historically had a very strong role in addressing a lot of these challenges. I think there needs to be a strong emphasis in, I suppose, institutional bodies like universities and educational systems, that it needs to be more integrated from top to bottom. I feel like sometimes there's not enough student voice and like active student voice in some of the greater decision-making aspects around sustainability, around inequalities, around access, things like that. And I think we need to have a stronger focus on the students who are marginalized, who have struggled to access the education system. Accessing education is such a challenge for so many, and there's multiple barriers even once you're within there. And I work a lot with refugees and asylum seekers. And I think that, you know, for a lot of the young people I've worked with, they just want to get through their education. They just want to get through things. They want to just, you know, it's kind of, I think engaging sometimes is a luxury that a lot of people can't afford due to time. Let's say you have kids, things like that. And I think there needs to be a greater emphasis on ensuring that we're reaching those people, and ensuring that we're engaging those people, and that they're not just being listened to now and again, but it's a consistent, fully integrated approach where people can actually see the result of their voices. We saw, I imagine that many of you might have been at the Youth Participation Conference with the council last couple of weeks ago in the Aula Maxima, and we were talking about the importance of active, real, consistent participation. And it's not just with young people, it's with kind of any community, especially those who don't feel their voices are represented. And I think, I suppose if we look at things like safe spaces and things like described in the Lundy model, I think that needs to be more embodied in educational institutions, in this kind of addressing and looking at the challenges that the SDGs kind of create, but also work to address.
I think one thing when we think about how students have organized over the years, we often see them as the front of these kind of social change movements. I think one thing that's really important to note, it's not in the actual rooms of decision making. I think young people and students in general were not in those rooms of decision making, especially from the perspective of politics. As a young person, you don't really have an opportunity to engage with politics unless you join a political party, which is something, well, I certainly try to avoid at least. But you know, that's something we need to really consider, and how it manifests itself is these kinds of self-organizing into campaigns. And you know, like one example of this would be in more recently the sort of student democracy protests in Asia and the massive campaign of those. But I think one that's actually here on campus that we saw was the food bank, which ties into sites of world hunger. This is the way of where, students are self-organizing to try and do these things. And we've seen it in the likes of 2015 or the 2018 referendums where young people actually move forward. I think it actually comes from a place of, there isn't that space for us in decision making that there should be. And from that sort of, I don't want to say born out of frustration, but born out of a sort of need to want to actually try and make change. That's how these movements can build and where they come from.
So I think the role of students as a whole body is definitely organising mass mobilisation to hold Ireland accountable to its role in sustainable development globally and preventing climate breakdown both internally in the country via biodiversity protection and externally as in global stewardship via emissions reduction at home and also providing mitigation funds as a rich country to those most affected and as a student body fighting in many different ways as well to care for each other, to care for the marginalized students in the body and to care for the whole world. But I think in terms of education, the incorporation of the SDGs is important because sustainability and the intersections of justice issues should be central to any degree, from building design to food policy, from biology to medicine, and students are needed to advocate for that and change it both for themselves and future generations of students. And for all the people whose lives they will be able to positively affect with those tools and the people who they will be interacting with in the wider world. Because students are also, workers, they're parents or future parents, they're educators, they're members of civil society, they're part of different communities. And there's many, many different ways to fight for sustainability and development and justice without directly engaging in the SDGs or even being a traditional activist. But education is definitely important for giving those tools and I guess providing food for thought, the framework,
So yeah, I guess I would basically agree with most of what's been said there. I know that coming out of the very formal education we have in Ireland and you're leaving cert where you're in 9 to 4 every day looking just at these exams, you don't really have much of a chance to look outside that. And then going to university, which for me was 5 times bigger than my town, and basically meeting all these people and all these ideas, these societies, and even outside of your lectures, you've actually got a chance to explore this and actually have opinions and make your voice heard. And I think that's why student movements become so big. It is really our first opportunity to get our voice heard. And especially these days when we see younger youth movements like Fridays for Future, and young people are becoming activists before they can vote, before they, social media at such power, they can see all this and they want to change, so that by the time they even get to university, they're already shouting. And I think it really is changing, and students are only going to continue to keep up this change because it is our first chance to really actually make our voices heard in our universities and to our governments.
So as per the role of students in promoting the 2030 agenda, I think if we look at the spectrum of possible policy areas and if we look at sustainability, we can realize very quickly that students have shown the highest degree of effectiveness in putting forward in the political docket sustainability. So this, among all different policy areas, sustainability has been really one that students have forged with their own hands and voices, and it has born, especially in the second wave, as a student strikes movement, right? But I think that right now as we look back, the role that students had was to leverage the resources to make a social change, more than an institutional, more than a technical one. A social change has occurred. And I say that because when we look at where we need to go, we realize very quickly that in order to have that kind of long-term vision for sustainability in education and in society, we need to have constant social support. And social support can be galvanized in a number of ways. And while I was looking for different ways to explain this also to high school students, I found this model of social change by a Harvard Business School professor, John Cotter. And of all the elements that he identified, there were three that particularly applied and explained perfectly how students have played a pivotal role in promoting the SDG agenda. The first one is they have promoted and they have established a sense of urgency. We have a time frame. This is not common in a lot of social movements. We have a clear time frame, whether it is 2030 or 2050, institutions have already clocked somewhere that is ticking. We need to get moving and we need to get there fast. And this has happened because there is a climate conscious layer of educators, professors. They have already been exposed to the first wave of ecological thinking. So it's not a new policy issue. And at the same time, students have been incredible at self-organization. It was mentioned also by my fellow panelists. And if you look at the degree to which students have established a sense of urgency, as of 2019, there were 1,045 higher education institutions worldwide that voluntarily had pledged to become net zero by 2030 or 2050 at the latest. That means an incredible dedication of resources and efforts, and that was all voluntary. The second ingredient of social change was to create guiding coalitions. It was also mentioned that students have also a very hard time accessing the world of politics or the world of business as students as such. Whether the individual student is not a stakeholder in the public discussion, universities are. And universities can be the galvanizing hubs for to channel the students' priorities and students' framing of the sustainability issue to other public stakeholders. And they can do that in a number of ways, creating networks, but I will expand on that later. And the last point that I think is fundamental for the role that students have played is empowering broad-based action. Grassroots advocacy has been such an incredible tool for the promotion of the SDG agenda because we can easily identify local practices and we can do upscaling and downscaling, which is one of the major challenges if we look at system thinking. So with these three elements, urgency, coalition building, and broad-based action, students have played an incredible epistemic stewardship in bringing forward SDGs.
Yeah, I think I just maybe add my 2 cents on that as well, because something that kind of struck me and you kind of alluded to was that I think students are in a unique position when it comes to holding institutions to account, because we don't necessarily, not that we don't have things on the line, but we don't have, you know, being a student for most of us becomes our life. You know, and it's different if you're a student and you have children, or you're a student and you have other things going on in your life. But I think we are in a unique position to challenge the status quo in our institutions and really push things forward. And I think it's really important to reflect as well on the history of that, because, for example, in UCC, some of our most prized initiatives today came from students forcing them onto the agenda. So, for example, Green Campus, the Green Campus initiative was initiated by students who forced it onto the agenda. The University of Sanctuary as well was forced onto the agenda by students and is now one of our prized initiatives. And even things as far back as you know, the rights of LGBT students being recognised. The president of the Students' Union in 1980, Cathal Kerrigan, was almost removed from his post because he brought his boyfriend at the time to a college ball, and the governing body of the university at the time voted down establishing an LGBT society. And last October, Cathal was actually invited back to UCC for the unveiling of the Rainbow Walkway. So I think it's really important to take stock of that. That, you know, while we might sound like we're, you know, asking for too much sometimes, I think in 10 years' time, you know, the things we're asking for now will actually be the things that you cherish the most. And I suppose following on from that, you all kind of touched on it briefly as well, but if any one of you want to add to that, what role do you think students will play in the next 7 years as we move towards 2030? Does any one of you have a thought on that, or do you think it was kind of said already?
Sorry, it's just more so about the role we give students in the future, and it's like they need to be a equal stakeholder and an equal peer. And what I mean by that, like oftentimes in organizations, you'll have a committee or a group, and okay, let's establish a seat or a position just for the young people, or yeah, and that's what's worse is to say let's do a youth subcommittee, and no, you need to have that. Like they are an equal decision maker. You're not putting them to one thing. Like the person who is leading this can be, a young person, can be a 20-year-old, can be a student, and like it's to treat them as a colleague and a peer rather than isolating them in their own space. Bring them into. We need more young people in places, roles of decision making.
Adding on to that, I also think equally it's about the role that students take for themselves, because it's about not settling. If you have a youth subcommittee, use what little power that gives you to create, more seats, more space at the table.
And probably one last element that I wanted to add is that, so I think it's established that we need to undertake the social change, and it will take a lot of social support for it to really happen at an institutional level and it be long lasting. And students, sometimes I think it's really underlooked, but the students being at the forefront of this, however disruptive, helps humanize the narrative. And this is a fundamental selling point in the narrative of achieving sustainable development. It's not about technical problems, and it's not about a human, even though, again, I'm a climate activist, so I can see the other side of things. I would promote sustainable development even if it was just for biodiversity. But there also need to be this kind of social broad-based consensus, and humanizing the narrative of sustainability in your institution is a fundamental element to really involve all the stakeholders. Because again, university spaces or higher education spaces are not lone islands. There are businesses that can connect to the university space. There are definitely local councils that can connect to the university space. And narratives that are framed by the youth that have already an intergenerational perspective are set for success. So students at the forefront, however disruptive, can really play a fantastic role in shaping the narrative in a way that really helps the university connect with the external world, and not actively seeking out, not having to spend resources in identifying stakeholders. The stakeholders will see that that is a winning narrative. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. No, I completely agree. And it always strikes me as well, obviously, as working in the student union, our job is to represent students, and it always strikes me that students actually are the largest stakeholder here. In UCC, there's 24,000 of us. And I think we kind of forget that sometimes. So it is, not only should we be at the table, but we deserve to be at the table. As I always view university as like a microcosm of society, and like we are the citizens of this institution, so we should have a say in how it conducts its affairs and how it's run, etc. So that kind of ties in nicely to my next question. So I suppose in terms of active citizenship, what kind of potential and opportunities is there for students to participate in active citizenship? And I suppose how can universities and people working in student support services facilitate that? And I know many of you have been involved with different initiatives, like Ali, you're involved with Climate Assembly Air. Some of you have been involved with Fridays for Future societies, and any other organizations or voluntary roles. So why are these things important, and what opportunities are there?
Well, I suppose speaking from the society's perspective, I suppose in terms of, when I came into first year, like Ali, I'm from a very rural area, very rural, and there weren't many opportunities, I suppose, to engage in, I suppose, a broader community of young people or students or anybody that were interested in the similar issues that I was. And then coming to UCC, I got involved with what was STAR and is now Vulture Refugees. And getting involved, I suppose, in the world of societies, what really struck me was that it was for students by students. that these things and initiatives and actions and events were created by students for the students, that it was what students wanted to do, what they wanted to see, that they were creating their community. And so over the last 4 years, as I've become more and more involved, and I suppose as I've taken on this role, what really strikes me is that how important it is that there is that student to student support, and that students and their leadership is really appreciated. Like, I find myself now being in, I suppose, a student support role as well as being a student myself, is how important it is that, I suppose, in the terms of empathy and understanding and active listening, that you're really integrating what the students want and they want to see. Because I suppose at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to support these students to become active citizens. And you can see that, whereas giving me the opportunity to become involved with Ymca, for example, in that space, I learned how to organize events. I learned not just about the issues that were occurring in our society, but also how to tackle them, how to lobby, how to engage in policy making, how to, I suppose, organize outreach programs and this kind of stuff. And now as I graduate, I'm not just, I suppose, having a piece of paper with the degree, and I love my degree, but I now have all this experience in how to, I suppose, take action. Whereas before, it was the thought of standing and sitting in something like this was the most overwhelming, scary thing ever. Now I feel comfortable sitting up here. And I think having those opportunities where students can create and are empowered and supported to create and lead, I think leading is really important, that it's student-led. I think having those opportunities are just so beneficial. And I can see that now as someone who's been involved a long time, just the different things that a friend of mine who would never have ever thought about chairing a society, chaired a society and organized an amazing thing during lockdown. And I think that's something very important to me, is while we were online, working online, studying online, students immediately mobilized to ensure there was a sense of community online, that there was something for students, and the amount of action and, I suppose, real stuff that came out of that online world that you wouldn't have normally expected. I expected to go into my room, study online, and maybe get to Zoom call with my friends now and then. But instead, I was able to go to like scribble sessions with the Scribble Society or meetings with University of Sanctuary, and those kind of different communities, I suppose, really foster active citizenship. And I think that's because it's what students want to see, and they're embodying what they believe is active citizenship, and bringing others with them, I think, and creating that sense of community. And I know they mentioned community and solidarity, and I really think that peer-to-peer learning really helps create a toolkit for that.
Don't know about you, Maya. I still find this pretty overwhelming and intimidating. I think one important point when it comes to the capacity of young people to make change, like all of us here on this panel, we're going to be doing it. What's of far more value is when you can sit down with someone who is like maybe is reluctant, or even more so. And I know we find it, you're sitting down and you're like, well, yeah, I don't know, they should do this. And then suddenly someone who has a bit of experience says, oh, you can just send the letter here and they will do it. And you can see like something change in people. It's like catching a bug.
It's a snowball effect.
It is. No, it is. And what happens is people then suddenly realize, oh, you can make change. And then they learn and they make mistakes and they get better. And that's really important. And what's really important is to get more people in. And what I mean, where I think that's important is, you know, we often talk about what organizations people can get in. There's nothing more powerful than 4 or 5 friends just sitting down with a blank piece of paper and saying, you know, what are we going to do? And what's really important, and where the sort of roles of universities come into that, is showing that you're flexible and going to listen. Too often, and like we do see it, you would go in and say, look, is this something that we can do about this? And too often there's something wrong with the method, and people will say, no, that's not going to work because this and this. What we need to do is focus more on, okay, what is the effect you want to see? Well, these are the different options we have that we could go about, and like this is what we want, the change we want to affect. And so it's about giving more access for people to get involved, as decision makers, making sure that there's the flexibility to give them the space to do that, and then also like to give them the access to the institutions to actually not like just get in the positions and just start getting their hands dirty.
Yeah, so I think for me, I wasn't at all an active citizen until I went to college and I started joining societies, and I was involved in biostock, and I went from casually attending events to being a wildlife officer and helping run the Women in Biology event, to then going to NUIG and signing everything I could about the end sex road that no one wants and won't help anyone, but the NUIG is pushing it and avoiding all our questions. And it kind of very much taught me that you will face obstacles, but we can see like the NUIG management is a lot more visible and accessible to us than a government, and we can still make change on this level and then graduate from college and make that change on a bigger level. And it also comes into the fact that we have like so much peer learning in universities. It's not just what you learn in a lecture, it's what you learn in your friends. As you said, you sit down and someone says, oh, you can actually do that, like you can make a difference. And I think that comes through a lot in universities when you're not just meeting people the same age, the same class as you, you're meeting people like at the end of their degree who have run a society for a year and things like that. And you can really see just like all your different options and how you can get involved in so many different sectors. And it just really, I think it opens that door, and it just lets you kind of learn what even is an active citizen and how you can get your foot in that door and just start to become one.
I think that the role of students, especially in active citizenship and voluntary organization, is a fundamental one as we look at incorporating sustainability into higher education. For one simple reason, local organizations, so active citizenship associations or voluntary organizations, they are amazing information banks. They capture the needs of local communities that public stakeholders can't. That's basically what an organization is. There is an issue, the public services do not satisfy a specific need, an association of active citizens come up and tries to fix it. Now, the question is, how do we set up the university or our learning space to capture that information, to make sure that students are not advocating against institutional frameworks, so against the university, but on behalf of the university? How can we make sure that students are reaching out into the community to tap into the potential that we haven't so far used, just because the sustainability needs of today are new ones, and therefore the potential use of resources is still to be explored. We did an experiment in Rome, in my city. So we said, we have a problem at our university. We don't have enough SDG trainings, enough sustainability course offerings, and we don't want to be tokenistic about it. We don't want to simply make one course and then just leave it there. But the problem was it's extremely expensive. So how can we help the university transition into this? And we said, we started from the assumption that all the organizations, for-profit and non-for-profit, had the exact same problem, that they had the willingness to align with the Agenda 2030, but it was extremely expensive. They didn't know where to find the resources. So what we did is we sat down at a table with a blank piece of paper, and we tried to map all the organizations, for-profit and non-for-profit, that operate in the field of sustainability. In less than a month, we mapped 70. We reached out to 15 of them, and with 14 of them, we created a Council of Sustainability, the university being at the center of all the informations that can be shared between businesses, between NGOs, between youth associations on the field of sustainability. So instead of creating from scratch in a university setting, instead of inviting a guest lecturer from I don't know where and contributing to our Scope 1 emissions, we invited entrepreneurs in the field of sustainability and cryptocurrency. Instead of setting up new events, we set up a roundtable between experts of green business, NGO, charitable foundations, and even local stakeholders. We have a representative of the mayor in one of our events. All of these to say that active citizenship should be really incorporated into higher education, because it really gives an opportunity to the university to be in the community, to build a sustainable community, instead of being a virtuous yet alone example of sustainability in a society that isn't growing. remember, we need the social change. So we really need students to go out and reach on behalf of universities, not against universities.
So my last question before we move on to a Q&A, so have your questions ready. And probably a question I think that gets left out a lot of the time. Do you have any criticisms of the SDGs? And maybe more broadly as well, just the whole system of student voice and student leadership and the way it's operating at the moment that you'd like to share.
I suppose my main criticism of the SDGs, and you know what, they're lovely and they are great in terms of reaching out, and I suppose they're really nice, like you can market them really well, and they do reach, like they reached me, and they simplified things for me, and they introduced me to the concept of intersectionality as well, which I think is so important. But I suppose my main criticism would be the fact that we can see that we aren't going to achieve them. We see that we aren't going to reach the goals, but we're still going along with it, and we're still going along. Like at 2030, we're not going to achieve them. Maybe some of them, but we're not going to achieve the overall aim. So my main concern is that we're focusing, I think, too much time on the SDGs when we don't have that time. That time could be spent on potentially developing a different, maybe an evolved framework. We started with the Millennium Development Goals. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. We developed the Sustainable Development Goals. We really need to be putting time into developing the next thing, hopefully something better. And you can see that with a lot of different initiatives like COP26. There's been 26 COPs, the Conference on Climate Change. 26 means that it's not really working. And so something needs to be reevaluated. We have a tendency to just keep going until we reach 2030, and then what's going to happen then? So my main criticism is I feel like we're kind of wasting time a little bit. Not even a little bit, I think we're wasting time. And I think in terms of the SDGs, people tend to focus too much on them and not on, I suppose, the other aspects of things. And like, I think in terms of, I like the fact that they, promote partnership and, solidarity and community and things like that. But I feel like they get forgotten sometimes. In a lot of the discussions, we focus a lot on the singular goals, and that wasn't the original aim, was to approach them as an intersectional kind of capacity. So often I get asked about the SDGs, which one's your favorite? But I don't think you can really afford to focus on these singular things, as they all intersect and they all interlink. And if you address one, you have to inadvertently address another. And I think compartmentalizing different issues, there's a danger in that. I think we need to look at things in a more holistic way as well. And I know, like, that's one of the reasons I like climate justice, that it's looking, I suppose we tend to focus a lot on the stats and the figures and the science, and less on the social implications of climate change, the barriers that creates. So it's not just like barriers in terms of sea levels rising, but it's also barriers to healthcare. It's barriers to transport, it's barriers to education and things like that. And I think that in order to really address a lot of these challenges, there needs to be a greater focus on the local led grassroots knowledge, especially indigenous knowledge. We see a lot in these discussions around the SDGs that there is very little representation from those who are affected most by these challenges and these issues. And I saw that when I was at COP26 in terms of the room demographics. I was able to get into certain rooms. My friend from Hawaii, my friend from Peru, my friend from Kenya, they were not. And in fact, some of them couldn't even make it into the room. And that's just climate change. And it's across the board in terms of political engagement with refugees and asylum seekers. So often politicians will only they'll skip certain districts because they don't believe that they have a vote, when they do in fact have a vote in local elections. And it's that kind of thing that we're not really, I feel like we're focusing too much on the output and less on what we need. I think this, the urgency is what I'm trying to phrase, is that there isn't the urgency around them. And I think we need to look at developing something and evolving something away from focusing specifically on them as the only framework. I believe there's a lot of other options out there, and I'm a big fan of local-led stuff, Indigenous knowledge and grassroots knowledge, because I feel like some of these are the communities that are most affected. We need to look to them for the solutions and less to, I suppose, the overall groups and international groups and things like that. And I think universities and organizations have a really key role in advocating for that, because students as well, our voices are so often drowned out. And in order to enact, like, I suppose, urgent change, we need to get like corporations on board and organizations on board. And that's a challenge for, like, I suppose, students, because we're often seen as like individuals or less important sometimes as well. And universities have a really strong opportunity there to advocate for a lot of these goals and a lot of these objectives. And some universities are doing a class job. And I think there's that opportunity to influence others and kind of create, I suppose, a broader community that can advocate for them.
I think when we draw criticisms to the SDGs, it's not the actual goals themselves, not at all. It's about the framework that they are. So I like taking the actual aims out of it, the actual what it is in and of itself. I think it's great graphic design. No, they are, but like the truth is, I think we spend far too much time talking about the SDGs. There are so many trainings, there are so many courses, there are so many events, so many conferences discussing the SDGs, and I think we need to be putting more energy into actually looking at them and saying, okay, we need to implement them. Okay, so put the time, that money, that time, that energy into this is the initiative we're doing to combat this stuff. Like, you know, we have homeless students in UCC, you know, things like the food bank, you know, these kinds of initiatives saying, what are we going to do now to make that immediate change? And of course, things take time, but we need to have less of these consultations and reports. Like in Ireland, we're great for reports, and yeah, but we need to do more in the actual getting those projects underway. The other point is, like, as we see, there's 3 SDGs. One is decent work and economic growth. Then the other one is there's one with industry, and then the final one around institutions. Like, world poverty has a lot to do with economic growth. World poverty has a lot to do with how we have given the corporate sense and these spaces and the damage that has been done to these. It's not compatible without addressing those and the actual how our international business world is affecting these. And the problem is, you know, the SDGs are coming from countries like that. It's the nation states are the ones that are trying to implement them. And, you know, we need to address these fundamental flaws in our economic system if we're going to try and eradicate poverty. And then the final thing, like, a lot of the funding from the SDGs goes to these sort of talking space, when I think we need to put more into actual immediate, this is what we're going to do to address each of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, so first of all, the world powers aren't actually accountable to the SDGs, like, in any way. But the main thing for me, right, is that the SDGs fundamentally don't address root causes. They don't, like, address the systemic changes that need to be made to even like achieve such complex goals. You know, they say end poverty, but not end wealth accumulation and hoarding. They say zero hunger and good health, but not end privatization and commodification of basic human needs. They say good economic growth, but continuous growth is inherently unsustainable in a resource finite world. And, like, even that aside, they really are not much more than headings. Zero hunger doesn't mean food and land sovereignty. Zero hunger doesn't mean equal and free access to healthy and nutritious food. We can achieve zero hunger and still have a malnourishment crisis and food insecurity and people having to choose between meal and or rent. You know, there's SDG 16, peace and justice, but those are not always mutually inclusive. Their unjust peace exists, but our definitions of both violence and peace are too narrow. Political instability or revolution can be violent, but is homelessness and poverty and people dying of preventable disease not just as violent? Is it not violence to have, 10 times the amount of empty homes as homeless people, to produce food, enough food for 1.5 times the Earth population and still have people go hungry, to have stockpiles of unused medicine and vaccines while millions go without. That's not justice and it's not peace. But those are systemic issues that the SDGs don't touch, because as long as our streets are quiet, we're told that that's peace. And strong institutions, I mean, they may be strong, but are they just? Choose between two different people who will maintain the status quo, and that's only an illusion of democracy. Those are called strong institutions. So, yeah.
It's hard to follow that. That was very well said. I guess just something that's been very visible to me the last 2 weeks, as I was at the National Biodiversity Conference last week and Bloom the week before, and the SDGs are very pretty. At Bloom, they had this really pretty stand, all these foot squared boxes with the different SDGs stacked in a nice little pyramid, and then they were just there. And they were like, look what we're doing, like, they're there, we're talking about them. But as I said, we're just talking about them. They're like stickers. We put them on things. We're saying, these are the SDGs we're dealing with, but we're not actually doing anything. Like life on land, life on water, they were talked about a lot last week. And it was just the most infuriating conference I'd ever been at, because they just like, people need to do more. Well, again, not talking about any massive government action that will address the issues that we see. So yeah, as the SDGs, one of the issues I see is just how we use them. We use them just as talking points and stickers and like gold stars to put on the end of the week to be like, we talked about 3 SDGs this week, go us, without actually doing anything worthwhile or substantial about them. So I guess that's just the last 2 weeks, it has been very visible to me on that issue of the SDGs, and I guess it is reflected in what the other group has been saying as well.
So I think, first of all, I want to say that the SDGs have a good capital in terms of directionality. So they could be a good guiding light, especially for an early induction into what sustainability really is. They're very marketable. They have great design, and they're sponsored by one of the biggest organizations on earth. So of course they are a useful tool. But as we make them context specific, to in the setting of universities, I think that we need to be extremely careful about adopting a checklist approach. SDGs are not one-time things. So they require constant support. They require broad support from the bottom up. And that's why students are so pivotal in this process. So as we look at, let's say, closing this wonderful conversation, I think that one thing that we could do, that you could do, is cultivating not only graduate attributes, but your university communities. Integrating university communities means that the SDGs are not simply something that falls into the category of taking some boxes in the national guidelines and making a wonderful report. It's about interconnecting your students with what tomorrow's consequences of a series of challenges will be. So it's setting up your students for success. And one thing that we can do, that you can do, is education. SDG literacy across campus doesn't hurt, never hurts. So really thinking about how student affairs can contribute to making all these educational efforts integrated, and how universities through SDGs can be part of a bigger community really can help us, can be a lever for change. However, blindly following SDGs will not lead us anywhere. We need to understand the rationale, and this checklist approach won't take us anywhere. So education, SDG literacy, that's my 2 cents.
Thanks a million. Shane Mooney from Dublin Business School. Can I just first of all say that I'm very happy that our future is in safe hands, guys, once we move on. So thank you. What interests me, guys, and I think that we are in a lucky position now, and I'd like your opinions on this, that here in Ireland we have had a minister who has been very appreciative of and listen to the student voice, Mr. Harris, and I think that his engagement with USI has been fantastic over the last couple of years, and particularly through COVID. What I'd like to ask you very, very plainly and try to understand this is, what is the role of the third level institutions? Is it to enable you guys who have such good voices to get that voice out to the whole university community? Because I know that there's students out there that don't have the same passion as you guys have. So what is the role of what do you want us to do globally to get your message out there and to move this on from pretty boxes? And you know, you hit the nail on the head. I like pretty boxes because it makes it easy for me to see and to understand stuff. But what is it that we need to do to enable your message? Is it education? Is it in the classroom? Is it to get this out there? Or what do we need to do, guys?
I suppose universities have a very important role in helping to dismantle systems that prevent engagement and participation. They also have a very important role in amplifying the voices of students, and ensuring that those who aren't as typically heard are amplified. I think it also comes back to having a strong integration of and consistent integration of student voices and perspectives throughout the university, and not just on a singular level basis. I think it needs to be kind of throughout. And the most important thing is, you know, there's students who aren't engaged. In order to engage them, you need to show that their voices are extremely valued, that their voices are not just being listened to, but they're being actively implemented. And that when you, let's say you talk to students or you're engaged with students, you then show them where their voices are being implemented, where they are having weight, and what you are doing with those voices, not just collecting them and kind of then we never hear anything again. I think that's really important in terms of encouraging people to engage, because let's say I go to a consultation or something, I give my 2 cents, but then I never hear anything after it, and I see the same issues reoccurring. That will be really frustrating, and means that I'm probably less likely to engage again, because what's the point in engaging if I'm not actually being listened to? And I'm a student, I've got so many other things to be doing. It's like survival sometimes out here, you know, in terms of accommodation and food and things like that. So I think there's an opportunity for universities to, I suppose, amplify the student voices and advocate for students, but it also needs to be, we need to see where that's happening, and it needs to be, I suppose, transparent and accountable. I think is really important.
I think first off, like, universities can fight for social change too. Like that's important. Sometimes with institutions we say this is our scope and we can't go outside it. And there needs to be an idea of what the role is. But like when it comes to, like, you know, trying to combat poverty among students, you know, fighting for the reduction in the student contribution fee, fighting for these things, and, you know, taking a role in sort of saying these are the changes that we need to implement. I think another one is really instilling in that education space the actual like, you know, your students. And you sometimes have to say in conversations, you are a student in a first world country. Among that, you have been able to go to university. There are people in this country that can't, and instill a sense of, you know, if you just go get your degree and then go and get a job without using this massive privilege and chance of information to try and enact good change, well, you are not fulfilling what we brought you here for. Because, you know, university and secondary school education as well, it's all about, you know, creating people with qualifications to enter into the workplace. And I think we need to start making more of a change to, we're giving you also the tools to start creating social change as well.
I just want to talk a second about accessibility, because you know, when you say voice, whose voices are you talking about? You know, are your, first of all, I mean, your actual courses, but also the platforms that you are giving students, are they accessible to many different types of disabled students? Are they, you know, accessible to low-income students, and so on? You know, and then there's multiple types of voice as well. You know, there's putting that voice out there, but then there's also, you know, how how is your education framework giving people the tools to use their voice on, you know, their level in their workplaces, wherever they are as in community members, and you know, it still really matters even if they're not talking to a large quantity of people, because as you were saying, like there's thousands of us, and every new generation of students is going out into the world, and they matter, you know. So yeah.
I think as well, it was very evident to me in Dublin is that universities sometimes see themselves as a business and not as an educational institution. And they're not really addressing student needs or wants. Students don't want 14 million euros spent on a private alumni club. Students want like better education. They want their staff to care. They want like PhD students want a livable wage, or stipend as it is called, because it's not livable. And like it doesn't exist because the university management see it as a money-making tool. They're not looking to address the needs of students. They're looking for more income. They're looking to build a better, brighter university that moves up the rankings on whatever ranking they want at the time, while their students, as I said, they don't have accessibility. They can't afford to come to college because the student housing is now all penthouse suites and gold level suites because they're looking to attract investors. Like it's not, we can't feel empowered when our universities clearly don't even want us other than our money. And sorry. Finish up quickly, but I think so universities play such a role in education because they don't just educate their students. My parents didn't go to college, so when they educate me, I take that home. I tell my parents they are sick of listening to me talk about climate and the environmental crises, but they wouldn't be hearing about it if it wasn't for me, because what we learn in the classroom, we take home with us. We tell our family, we tell our friends. You're not just educating that bunch of people in front of you, you're educating everyone they interact with. And I think universities need to remember that and address that and actually look to the needs of the students and what they're looking to get out of their time in colleges.
I'll be extremely brief. I think there are two main strategies for university or third level educational institutions to really go hand on the sustainability challenge. The first one is operational. So sustainability should be effortless. If a lot of, like in my experience with student engagement, the main problem is that it takes so much effort to do some things that university administrators could do, but in the shoes of a student. If students have to start making the little decisions from banning plastic cups to trying to make the cafeteria more sustainable, to trying to establish scholarships for students that come from least economically developed regions, it really is a loss of resources. Students can be so much more than that. And if university administrators were to anticipate that, and we have a framework to guide this kind of action, I think that there could be a lot more progress. So this is from the operational side. So take more ownership in what the students are demanding. I think it's the first one. The second one is create space for advocacy. Advocacy can be disruptive. It is disruptive. It should be disruptive. But for the first time, we have, I mean, not for the first time, but at least in my experience, there is the youth, so under 35, have for the first time, one of the most climate conscious generation. And there was the 2020 UN report that indicated that also they're the most favorable towards sustainability action. So if there is any kind of misalignment between what students are advocating for and your institutional strategy, it means that something is off. For the first time, we are extremely well educated on sustainability challenges, and we have also a pretty good idea of what local solutions are because we are extremely well connected to other social movements. So using advocacy of students as the guiding light could be a good idea.
We unfortunately don't have time for any more questions because I know you're on a tight schedule, so I'll leave you go. But I just wanted to really thank all our panelists. They were fantastic, and thank you for inviting us and giving us the opportunity to speak to you all today. So thank you very much.